Attention all 8.6 owners, tired of this failure-prone throwout bearing design? So are we. That's why we designed the ultimate fix, and I'm going to show you guys right now. So we all know the OEM throwout bearing sucks. It fails too easily, it makes noise. I've seen these things seize up and disintegrate. We all know they suck. Here's some problems with this thing. So I know all the way up to, let's say, about 2009, the WRX used the same style bearing. I've seen this guy get revisions and basically band-aids over time, but it's still the same poor design. Back in my dealer days, we were doing WRX clutches at like 10, 15K, not because the clutches were going bad, but because these throwout bearings were failing at like 10 or 15K. What's wrong with this thing? So, you can hear that, but this guy's actually not that bad. I've seen far worse. But why do these things fail? This is an open face bearing. This is what touches the face of the pressure plate. Being open face, all this grit ends up going inside the bearing itself, all the little ball bearings, which wears these out prematurely. This is the bearing we're using. Through my tenure in the automotive field, I'm familiar with this style throwout bearing. You can see it's a much bigger, much tougher bearing. It's a sealed face bearing. The opening is actually on the back side, which means when it touches the clutch, all the garbage cannot get into the ball bearings. So being a true sealed bearing that's not exposed to the clutch wear material like the OEM bearing, this guy's gonna be far stronger. That's why we chose this bearing. In conjunction with Battle Garage RS, this is what we designed. So we made in-house a carrier for this style throwout bearing. These two will need to be pressed together, but it will have the same stack height as the OEM bearing, which means the clutch pedal engagement and actuation should not change. If you see these two slots on the ends, this is going to attach the same way as the OEM bearing, using all the same OEM clips. And it should work with all the upgraded forks like OEM. In this instance, we're installing a Verus fork into this vehicle. Alright, so one more issue you guys are probably already familiar with is that sometimes on clutch services, people are also replacing this front plate on the transmission itself. Here's why. Let's take a look. So you can see all this damage in the grooving that the old throwout bearing has caused. How does the old throwout bearing cause this damage? Let's take a look. Alright, so if we look at this guy on the inner diameter where the throwout bearing rides on the transmission snout, you can see on the inside all the grease that used to be there is all burnt and caked up by now. And what happens is this guy will overheat, burn out all the grease that was inside this bearing, as well as the grease that helps lubricate this inner diameter to slide on the shaft. What does that mean? Now that there's no grease, we basically have metal on metal contact every time we step on the clutch, which is why that snout developed all the damage that it did. Two differences, right? If we look on the inside of this thing, it does have a little bit a reservoir for grease, but obviously not enough. Here's how we solve this. If we look at this, there's a deep cavity that acts like a grease reservoir. So every time you push on the clutch, that grease reservoir wipes a new layer of fresh grease on the shaft so that you have solid and consistent clutch pedal feel every time you step on the clutch. Plus, nothing on the inside is getting worn, like with the OEM setup. So obviously I have the bearing and the carrier pressed together. Why don't I lubricate everything and show you guys how this all assembles. Yeah, 3 brand new springs from Subaru. You should always replace these springs every time. Amsoil heavy duty grease. This stuff that goes inside the bell housing when you do a clutch job. Make sure you use the correct temp and pressure grease, because your regular parts store grease is not gonna hold up to the pressures and temp that happen inside a bell housing. Some key spots that I'm gonna grease. The pivot for the slave cylinder push rod, that guy needs some grease. I know I can grease it when this guy's installed in the car, but I'd rather just do it now. Where the pivot sits, I'm gonna put a big glob in there. Not a big glob, just like a finger full. That actually should be sufficient. I'm gonna grease the pivot side too. Any of these surfaces we're gonna have to grease. At the top of these fingers where it's gonna pivot, and then in this instance, the inner side, we're gonna put grease right there too. That should be it for our fork. We can assemble the springs inside this guy. Again, metal on metal, since these two are gonna touch. I'm gonna throw a hair of grease right there, because I've seen these guys wear excessively from again, no lubrication too at the pivots or where they attach. All right, I'm gonna just. All right, so this guy should be good. All right, so I got this big dollop of grease. What are we gonna use this for? So remember our grease reservoir? I wanna fill that entire reservoir with grease. So insert my lubricated finger. You guys can look at my hole afterwards. So that cavity's completely filled up. I'm just gonna wipe a little bit on the other side too. There's kind of an art to this because if you put too little, metal on metal contact could occur. You put too much and then that grease is gonna sling out potentially into the clutch assembly, potentially cause an issue there. So a little bit of an art how much grease you're supposed to put on all this stuff. Again, where our fork is gonna pivot on and where the inner parts are gonna rest, we wanna grease those guys. Even though we've already greased the fork, I still wanna grease these guys. So that should be good. All right, cool. All right, good to go. Go ahead, let's go put lubricant on my shaft. So some key areas on this guy. Although we already greased the pivot area on the fork, I'm gonna grease this pivot ball too. So I'm gonna get a hair behind the pivot ball also because that clip is gonna rest behind that pivot ball. In this instance, we're using the uprated Verus pivot ball as well. This is gonna be key too, where this portion right here that goes on the ID of the pilot bearing, there needs to be grease here too. I have seen on other transmissions where people have not put grease and the pilot bearing will seize up and either get stuck on the transmission or damage the crankshaft. You don't want any of those to happen, so put a little bit of grease there, please. We are going to put some sparingly because remember we already put a bunch on the ID of our carrier, so we're gonna be sparing with this. Just enough to cover the surface. And I'm gonna wipe some excess off. The last place I wanna put grease on is actually the splines where the clutch disc moves back and forth. This is gonna be key not to put too much. Too little and the clutch disc could bind on the splines. Too much and this excess grease gets slung inside the clutch assembly and on the friction material and cause clutch issues, and we do not want that. So that little bit that was residue on my fingers, I'm gonna call that enough. And then one more trick you can do if you have your clutch disc out is you can take your clutch disc and just put it over this thing one time, pull it off, and that should wipe away a lot of the excess and you should be good. So just pro tip. Now that we have all our assemblies greased, why don't I show you guys how to assemble everything. You notice I have this boot off. This boot goes on the back side. I leave this off on purpose because when I put this fork in, I want to make sure 100% that those clips clipped onto the pivot ball. So we're actually going to put this on last. All right, everyone does this a little bit different. I'm just going to show you guys the way I do it. Again, these two have to clip onto that pivot ball. So I'm gonna walk it back and forth, and audibly I do not hear this thing clipping in, so here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna do a reach around. Good thing I have my boot off so I can see that this thing's not clipped in all the way. I'm gonna grab my pocket screwdriver. If you have a pick, you can use a pick too. Okay, there we go. 1, 2. You heard that last click. So 100%, I know that fork is clipped in there on the pivot ball. So now that I know the fork's on, we're gonna put our boot on. Dry silicone spray, my secret sauce for everything. Here's the secret. I'm gonna spray the lip of this thing so that it's easier to install. All right, you wanna come back here. So the lip of this guy's gotta go inside the bell housing. See, I'm just working it in with my pocket screwdriver. Careful not to poke a hole through this thing. Poke it all the way through. And I'm just gonna make sure this thing is all the way seated. And that's excellent. Now we know this is clipped all the way in and this guy's completely inserted too. You don't want any dust and crap falling inside the clutch, of course. So we're gonna match up these two with the fork. Pretty self-explanatory. Bam. All right, and before we do anything, you can see that excess grease. I'm just gonna cut off that excess grease. Again, too much, and that grease goes where it's not supposed to. Cool, I'm just gonna use my finger, wipe off a little more of this excess. Then while we're here, there's one more key area that I see people miss all the time. Actually, we want a hair, just a hair, on the face of this throwout bearing. And we want that because the face of this throwout bearing contacts the fingers of the pressure plate. And as I'll show you in a second, again, metal on metal contact. Usually what I've seen, if you don't put a little bit of grease on the face of that throwout bearing, you're gonna wear out the pressure plate fingers prematurely like this. This is the exact car we're installing our ultimate throwout bearing on. You can see right there, these pressure plate fingers, that old throwout bearing wore a groove all in these fingers. That's exactly what you don't want to happen. All right, while we're over here, I'm gonna put some anti-seize before I forget. And what I'm putting anti-seize on is these two dowels on the engine block that help locate the transmission to the engine block. Always wanna make sure these dowels are here because you can actually cause engine block or transmission damage. I'm putting anti-seize so the next time this trans comes out, it does not get stuck. Usually they get stuck on those dowels. It got stuck this time and luckily it wasn't too bad, but we're going to be nice to the next guy and put anti-seize on these dowels. It will aid in installation and then it will also aid the next time we have to remove it. So anti-seize, please. All right, just about there with assembly. We got these two paper clips left. This is optional, but I'm gonna do it because I've seen these paper clips wear away, or like paper clip will wear away or it'll wear away at the fork. Again, you don't want metal on metal contact, right? So where this thing hooks into the fork, I'm gonna put a hair of grease. And then same thing, this is gonna rest on your carrier or your OEM throwout bearing. Just a hair of grease on that guy. Hair of grease goes a long way. These guys, it's gonna be tough to show you, but if you just go on the front, hook that guy in there. It's tough when we're under pressure and there's a camera in your face. But we're gonna hook that guy over and then slide it over. Come on, slide. Slide. Oh, there we go. Bingo. Just like that. We're gonna do the next one. And hook it in underneath. Roll it up. There you go, much better. Show you guys how this works. So imagine push rod for the slave cylinder. The fingers on the clutch are kind of like a spring in itself, so this is exactly how that guy works. And if we take a close look right there, you can see our reservoir is doing its job every time. New film of grease, as it should be. We're gonna connect up our battery, check how the clutch pedal feels, and then go ahead and start the car. We'll also go for a road test too. All right, well, here we are. Let's start it. Okay, cool. Well, everything looks and sounds and feels good so far. Why don't we go for a road test? We're gonna find a nice straight section. Yeah, honestly, nothing so far, nothing to note. It drives like OEM, it's quiet, shifts fine. I've a fair amount of time in this customer's car. We've done a fair amount of work to it, so it drives like I expect. 3-2 downshift. I guess the next test is high RPM shifting, so we'll do that. All right, so after we make this U-turn, we should have a good straight section to do some high RPM shifting. All right, let's do it. I'm not gonna break the law, but it's funny, the shifter feels better at high RPM. High RPM's the test. If the trans was gonna clash or grind, that was gonna be it. The other one is going into first or reverse from a standstill, but again, don't have any concerns or anything else notable. It's quiet and it drives like OEM, so. All right, so first road test went well. Drives like OEM and it's quiet, but we should have a more durable and reliable throwout bearing, and clutch system in general. That was the prototype. Next time you see us, we'll have the production model, so stay tuned for that. Catch you guys next time.